In this clip, we're going to learn how to use colliders. Colliders allow objects to interact with one another in the physical space. What that means is that whenever we have multiple objects and they're trying to collide with one another or pass through one another, colliders can tell those other game objects not to pass through it. So for example, if we had our player moving throughout the scene and the player clipped with this barrel in its current state, it would be able to go right through it. It would almost be as if it didn't exist. So what we can do to block the player from going through it is to add a collider. To add a collider is just like adding a component. A collider is actually a component. So let's go to Add Component, go to the Physics category, and here we can choose from a list of different collider shapes that we can use. Typically, we want to use a collider shape that fits the form of the game object. So in this case, we would use a capsule collider. You also have the ability to use a mesh collider. If you can get away with using a capsule collider, sphere collider, or a box collider, that would be best. Mesh colliders should only be used as if there is no other choice. Mesh colliders can get very expensive, especially if the model that is being used with it has a high poly count. With this barrel, we could say that it has around 200 vertices on it. If we were to use the mesh collider, it would add another 200 vertices to this game object because the mesh collider is actually being counted as another mesh. And so in this case, I would use a capsule collider. Now the capsule collider right now doesn't actually fit the barrel very well. So what I would want to do is modify the collider shape. To edit the collider, you can do it a couple of different ways. The first way is to do it interactively by activating the Edit Bounding Volume button. Here what I can do is I can left click and drag these dots as handles and modify the shape. So let's left click and drag the top dot, and that will raise it into the air. Now let's grab these dots on the side, and this will adjust the radius. Now you'll notice here that I can't really tell if it's conforming to the shape all that well. Typically, whenever you are modifying something like this, it's good to orbit around the object just to check all angles. You could also just switch to one of the orthographic views by clicking on X and switching to orthographic or isometric. And you can see that we are way off here. We can left click and drag this up to reach the bottom. Let's adjust the side of the radius here, as well as this one. And that looks pretty good. You could also switch to another angle just to check it. In this case, it's off in this axis. And there we go. Now, you can also type in the values that you need. So in this case, I'm going to type in 0 on the X, 0 on the Z, and then 0.5 on the Y. I'm going to adjust the radius to 0.4, and then the height we're going to set to 1. You can see that that fits the barrel much better. Typically, you can use that edit collider to get close, and then I like to round off the values using these type-in values. Let's go ahead and switch back to the perspective view, and we can take a look around the object now. You can see that that collider fits the form pretty well. It's also important to know that with colliders, you're not stuck to just a single collider. You can add multiple collider components. In this case, I would like to add a sphere collider to the object. Let's go to Add Component, Physics, Sphere Collider. The reason that I'm adding a sphere collider is not to actually block the player, but I want to detect the player if it comes within a certain range of this barrel. So a great way to use this would be to adjust the sphere collider to a value of around 1.25. I would like to create the behavior for this barrel that if the player got too close, the barrel would explode. Now the problem with this collider as it stands is that it is a collider. It would actually block our player from getting through inside of this area. And so a way that I can remedy that is by actually using the sphere collider as a trigger. Now a trigger is different from a collider because it allows the object, another physical object like the player, to pass through it. And what it does is it sends a message to anyone who's listening saying something has entered the trigger. It also has the ability to check to see if something is staying within the trigger, and also if something is exiting the trigger. So triggers are used with scripts, and they can create all kinds of behaviors. So in this case, I would use this trigger as, if the player object has entered this trigger, start the countdown of the exploding barrel. Now that's just a very simple example, but here you can see that we know the difference between a collider and a trigger. Now let's take a look at using a rigid body, as we want to make this object more physical.